All right. Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. We'll give folks one more minute as I know we have a lot of folks joining at the moment. We'll get started in about 30 seconds. All right, let's go ahead. We've got a good critical mass of participants out there. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where in the world you are. I'm Andrew Logan with Ceres. I direct our work with the oil and gas sector. Thank you all for joining us today for a webinar which will cover the highlights of our second annual report benchmarking the greenhouse gas emissions of onshore oil and gas production in the US. If you're joining us here today, you know that methane has become an increasingly critical area for investors and for policymakers as well. And as you'll hear today, this benchmarking analysis helps explain why that is. As you'll hear, there's tremendous variability in emissions between producers, even within the same basin, even between producers of the same size. And that difference is particularly stark when you look at the sort of top and bottom quartile performance bands, as you will hear later on. This means that for many companies, there is considerable room for improvement in their performance. Even just bringing all producers up to the mean emissions level would be hugely beneficial for the climate. And that has implications for policymakers because it makes clear that there's tremendous room to reduce emissions in much of the sector. And it's important information for investors who can use this analysis to determine which of their holdings are doing a good job managing methane and which have clear room to improve. And as you'll hear, the EPA data contains a tremendous amount of useful and actionable details. So not only can someone see who the leaders and laggards are, but you can see at some level, why their emissions differ. Of course, again, you all probably know that there's been a lot of focus in the last year or two on the best approach to measuring methane emissions in this sector, particularly the value of measuring some emissions sources directly rather than using emissions factors. And so one of the interesting parts of the discussion today, we'll be hearing from our speakers about both what this data from the EPA can tell us and what it might not yet tell us. So without additional delay, let's get to our speakers. So today you'll be hearing from speakers representing all of the groups who partnered on this report. So first you'll hear from Pi Russell with ERM, who will speak to the methodology behind the report. Then you'll hear from Leslie Feldman from Clean Air Task Force, which is Ceres' partner in this work. And Leslie will highlight some of the key report findings. And then finally, Luke Helgren from ERM will present the online data tool, which allows you to basically generate your own report based on the company's basins and sort of data slices that you're interested in. And we'll absolutely save ample time for questions. Would ask that you submit them via the Q&A function, the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to submit them as they occur to you. We'll compile them and answer as many as we can at the end of the speaker presentations. So with that, I'm going to pass on to Pi Russell from ERM.
Thanks, Andrew. So I'm going to give a quick overview of the methodology that is used in the report. So on just overall, almost all of the data in the report is from publicly available information, and then we do a lot of data processing and some calculations to calculate the individual metrics that we use in the report. So starting on the next slide, please talk about EPA's greenhouse gas reporting program. So EPA's greenhouse gas reporting program, specifically subpart W, which covers the oil and natural gas industry, is the primary source of data used in the report. So just some background on the greenhouse gas reporting program, or GHGRP, is that it requires all facilities that produce more than 25,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent a year to report their emissions. For the onshore production segment under subpart W, which is what this report focuses on, a facility is defined as all production equipment within a producing basin. So unlike a more conventional definition of a facility within a fence line, this would, for a given company, could include hundreds of individual well pads, and the equipment on those well pads are all captured under a single facility as it's defined by EPA. So for the onshore production segment, companies have to report 17 emissions from 17 individual sources. Those are listed here on the table on the right. You can see the individual greenhouse gases that they have to report across methane, CO2, and N2O. And the data that companies report themselves to EPA captures all of the production data, the oil and natural gas production data that's used in the report, and over 99% of the emissions data. So on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about some additional emissions that we add to the EPA reported data. And these we calculate using approaches, a combination of company reported data from the GHGRP and emissions factors from EPA's annual greenhouse gas inventory, which is a separate national level inventory that EPA develops each year. And so these are 6 different emission source categories, again, that companies do not report to EPA under subpart W to calculate actual emissions, but they do report certain activity data, such as the number of pieces of equipment that can be used, and take those activity data and apply the greenhouse gas inventory emissions factors to calculate emissions for these sources. So again, this is 6 additional sources that companies do not report for themselves, but that we calculate the data for. And we do this for completeness to add to the number of sources that are captured in the analysis. But overall, the emissions from these sources are very small, less than 1% of the total emissions across individual companies and the full data set. On the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about some of the ways that we group the data, and you'll see this in some of the slides that we show later on. And so we take the 23 individual emission source categories, and we group them into 5 broader aggregated categories. So the first 2 are process and equipment vented emissions and process and equipment flared emissions, are aggregations of those other 23 individual sources. So there's a number of different sources that report that we capture in the process and equipment vented category, that things like pneumatic devices, liquids unloading, anything that's vented from tanks. So that's a group of multiple sources that are in that category, and we can see on the right that those represent about 34% of the total emissions on a carbon dioxide equivalent basis in the reported data for 2020. And then similarly, process and equipment flared emissions are from multiple sources. These are things like if you have for example, a tank battery that is capturing the gas with a VRU, and rather than venting it, it's being flared. Those types of sources are captured here. And we can see that that's about 12% of reported emissions. And the final 3 source categories here, associated gas, venting and flaring, fugitive emissions, and other combustion, those are all individual source categories of the 17 that are reported to EPA. So we take those numbers themselves as they're directly reported, and because they're representative of more easily defined source categories, unlike the process and equipment vented and flared emissions, which are composed of multiple sources. So the next slide, I'll just quickly talk on the different intensity metrics that we use in the report. So we use 2 metrics in addition to taking the gross production and gross emissions absolute basis that companies report and that we calculate. We also calculate 2 emissions intensity metrics. One is a methane intensity metric that uses the Natural Gas Sustainability Initiative Methane Intensity Protocol, which was a methodology for calculating methane intensity that was developed by the Edison Electric Institute and American Gas Association. This is a percentage-based intensity that takes methane emissions that are allocated to the natural gas value chain and divides it by the methane or the produced methane. So it's a methane divided by methane intensity, and the emissions are allocated to the gas value chain in the numerator using an energy ratio, which is the energy embedded in the natural gas relative to the energy embedded in the natural gas and oil. So it allows us to take the portion of methane emissions that, using the energy ratio, the natural gas value chain is responsible for. And so that methane intensity represents a natural gas value chain intensity. The GHG intensity is a capturing all emissions reported. So it's not just methane, it's CO2, N2O, and methane in the numerator. And then it's dividing that by the total energy embedded in the produced oil and produced natural gas. And so that's a CO2e per BOE metric, which is a commonly used metric in the industry. So you'll see that throughout this report. And again, those are the two main metrics that we use for measuring emissions performance. So that's a really quick overview, and happy to answer any questions in the Q&A, but I'll pass it on to Leslie.
Great, thanks, Pi. Go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the key findings and conclusions from the benchmarking report. Next slide. The reported methane emissions intensity of natural gas production and the greenhouse gas emissions intensity of the oil and gas production varies dramatically across producers, as Andrew noted earlier. We see that the highest emitting oil and gas companies had a reported methane emissions intensity of nearly 24 times that of the lowest emitting companies. As I'll show in a few slides, the average emissions and intensities vary significantly across geographic areas, but emissions intensity also varies even between similarly sized operators in the same basins. And this is largely due to different equipment choices and operational practices. Overall, pneumatic controllers were the largest source of reported production segment methane emissions, making up 62% of the total. And fuel combustion equipment, including engines and heaters, was the largest source of CO2 emissions, responsible for 58% of all CO2 emissions. In addition, venting and flaring of associated gas are significant contributors, particularly in oil-heavy basins, which I'll show in some figures in a few slides. So, on the next slide here, the figures on this slide summarize emissions by the major source categories that Pi already outlined. So in the figure on the left, you can see how the emissions from each of the 5 categories adds up to the total emissions. On a CO2e basis, using the 100-year GWP, methane and CO2 emissions are roughly equivalent, but methane would be much more significant using the larger 20-year GWP. The largest source of methane emissions are process and equipment venting, as Pi noted, and that is dominated, as you can see in the figure on the right, by pneumatic equipment. And the second largest source of reported methane emissions are fugitives, but the reported data does not include abnormal process conditions, also sometimes called super emitters. And we know these methane emissions are significant, and they're a significant part of the total industry methane emissions that are not fully accounted for in this reported data. So on the next slide, next I'll go through some high-level basin results, and then after that I'll talk about some high-level company results. I'll go fairly quickly just to orient you to the data and highlight a few key trends, but all of the data is available in the report and on the interactive website, which Luke will walk you through after I finish this part of the presentation. So here are the basins ranked from highest to lowest oil and gas production. And some key highlights. In some basins, methane emissions are larger than CO2, even using the lower 100-year GWP. The Permian Basin has the highest production and also the highest level of total emissions. And CO2 emissions from oil-heavy basins like the Permian and the Williston are significant, while in the San Juan, it has disproportionately high methane emissions for its production level. Next slide. Here are those same basins in the same order, now showing a breakdown of the emission sources. You can see high levels of combustion and associated gas venting and flaring, which are the orange and purple bars in the Permian and Williston. But in many other basins, the process and equipment venting, the light blue, is the largest source. Next slide. Combining all of that data, here we present the two different emissions intensities. On the left, the NGSI methane intensity, which considers only methane emissions and gas production, and the total of the ratio of gas to oil and gas production produced. On the right, the greenhouse gas emission intensity. So high CO2 emissions mean that for basins like the Permian and Williston, methane intensity is relatively low, while the greenhouse gas intensity is quite high. Next slide. Next, I'll show the national company level results for the top 100 companies. This shows production and emissions for the top 100 oil and gas producers that report to the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. As you can see, there's not a linear relationship between production and emissions. Emissions are driven by company operations and types of equipment, not by production levels alone. Now, the next slide, this figure shows how emissions break down by overall by source category. As I mentioned earlier, process and equipment vented is the largest category, but for some companies, associated gas venting and flaring is significant or larger. And you can see the variation between the companies quite clearly here. And next slide. And here again are the two different emissions intensities, this time for each company. You can see the wide variation in both intensity values. Next slide. This figure shows how production and emissions break down across companies. And there's a few interesting insights here that I wanted to highlight. The top two rows show total hydrocarbon and gas production, respectively. You can see the top 100 companies make up 91% and 92% of hydrocarbon and gas production. But looking at the bottom two rows, those same 100 companies are responsible for 74% of methane emissions and 77% of greenhouse gas emissions. So that means that the remaining 203 companies are responsible for a disproportionately large share of emissions. So finally, I just wanted to spend a minute to put all this data and these numbers into the US regulatory context. There are clear steps that oil and gas producers can take to reduce their methane emissions. Strong EPA regulations will set a floor so that all companies employ basic management practices and technologies to reduce emissions. In November 2021, EPA proposed methane regulations. These are sometimes called Quad O-B and Quad O-C. These regulations would require companies to replace venting pneumatic equipment with zero bleed options and conduct frequent and routine leak detection and repair at most facilities, with a big exception for certain facilities with the potential to emit less than 3 tons per year. And then recently, the Methane Emissions Reduction Program was created. This was a provision of the Inflation Reduction Act, and it requires EPA to impose a charge on oil and gas sources reporting to the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program for any emissions above a certain threshold. This program is complementary to the EPA proposed regulations, and it incentivizes operators to reduce emissions years before the EPA rules would be fully implemented in the states. It also requires EPA to revise the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program within 2 years to ensure that reporting requirements and the methane charge are based on empirical data that more accurately represent observed methane emissions. So with that, thank you for your time. Happy to answer questions in the Q&A, and I'll pass the presentation to Luke.
Great. Thanks, Leslie. All right, let me share my screen, get to the landing page of this report. All right. So I am going to go through some of the resources that are provided with this report and more specifically focus on the interactive Tableau data dashboards that are reflective of effectively all of the charts and major data points within the report, as well as reflective of a lot of the data that are included in an Excel spreadsheet that can be downloaded on this page as well. So there are a lot of data points, as kind of have been mentioned. EPA GHGRP data is quite extensive. We're looking at hundreds of companies over now a span of 3 years with a lot of different emission sources and different production basins. So there are a lot of different ways of breaking the data down. We've chosen to kind of organize the data in three types of concepts, or 3 themes. So the first theme and the first window of dashboards really focuses on just the top 100 producers and top 100 rankings. So this is going to look familiar to some of those top 100 bar charts that are in the report. It's focusing on those primary metrics of hydrocarbon production, total GHG emissions, and then the intensity, GHG intensity, methane intensity, and then the GHG emissions by sources. This kind of format is consistent across the different dashboards. So, within this one window, this is looking at right now just hydrocarbon production and emissions, but there are also these additional tabs that have additional dashboards that have the similar format associated with those other metrics. So just to orient everyone on kind of the user capabilities of this dashboard and other dashboards, there are a variety of different filters and slide bars and highlights and pop-up dialog boxes, pop-up windows that provide a little bit more flexibility in visualizing the data and really dialing in on specific and more granular data points. So this default chart that we're looking at right now is really focused just on 2020 data year. So this is what's reflected in the current report, but we do have 2019 and back to 2018 data as well that can be viewed. The GWP values can also be changed in the report. We're using the most recent AR6 values for 100-year time frame. So this can be changed to 20-year or the current EPA requirement, which is still tied to AR4 values. This slider bar also, there are a lot of bars that are being shown here. It's looking focused on the top 100. So if there is an intention to maybe break that down a little bit and focus on just a selection of companies, say the top 20, then this will do that and maybe a little bit easier to visualize. Additionally, the pop-up dialog boxes provide a little bit more granular data and just focus data on different features within the dashboards. So anytime you put a cursor over a feature, a dialog box will appear, give a little bit more information on that. So in this case, this is showing the breakdown of hydrocarbon production by oil and natural gas, kind of consistently throughout these dashboards. We've selected the top 20, so this is still showing the top 20. You can select any feature and it will give you a little bit more insight into that feature. So again, this is the major objective of this is to take the data that are in the report and provide a little bit more interactive report generating platform or data generating platform that can provide additional data to what can be provided within the report. I want to just mention one other thing for this window specifically. As I already mentioned, these first few dashboards are focused on the top 100 producers, but for those of you who are familiar with the report, the last several slides of that report, the appendix slides, are focused on different rankings. So these are top 100 rankings by different metrics, not necessarily tied to the top 100 producers. And so there's a selection of the metrics that are shown in those appendix slides in the report, and they're also provided here. Moving on, the next window, the next theme of data that we're presenting here is focused on basin level data. and then more detailed than that, production at a company level metrics at a company level by basin. So the first few dashboards within this window are reflective of the first few dashboards in the report that Leslie just went over that are focused just on the basins. One note to make about the difference between the report and these dashboards is the report was focused on, I believe, the basins responsible for 95% of total production that was reported to GHGRP. This data dashboard is inclusive of everything that's reported to EPA, so that is inclusive of 16 additional basins that provide very little production relative to the others, but it is inclusive of all production basins that are included within the GHGRP. So these first few slides focus on those same primary metrics: hydrocarbon production, emissions by source, and then the methane and GHG intensity. Similarly, the year analysis, the time series analysis can be selected to look at how these metrics change between 2018 and 2020. Those GWP values can similarly be changed. The next kind of step and breakdown of this is more reflective of the majority of the slides that are actually in the report that are focused on the metrics associated with producers at the basin level. So in the report, there are a lot of charts associated with the top 4 production basins. And so this is providing those similar charts, but it's inclusive of, instead of just those top 4 producing basins, every basin. So right now, Permian was the top producing basin in 2020. This is showing all producers within the Permian Basin in 2020. So this is going to look really similar to the charts that are in the report, but instead of, as I said, limiting it to just those top 4, all 36 basins that are in the GHGRP are located within this, and all producers within those basins are provided here. So, coastal basins, maybe not the greatest example. We can go to Arcoma, and it will show all the producers that report any level of production in Arcoma. This, consistently it's cascaded through the other dashboards. So, this is looking at the emissions by source associated with the producers in the Arcoma production basin. And again, similar to the previous dashboard, there is a lot of additional information that can be viewed through the pop-up dialog boxes. The last window, the last theme, is not necessarily pulled out specifically within the report, but is focused on providing company-specific data. So this is providing a lot of the different metrics associated with individual companies and just providing a dashboard that visualizes and presents all of those data points kind of in one place. So the first few windows, or the first few dashboards associated with this window, is really just focused on selecting an individual company. And I guess I should note that this is not just focused on the top 100 producers. This is, again, inclusive of every producer that is included in GHGRP. And so, in 2020, or in 2020, there were 303 producers. The last couple of years have shuffled a bit, but around 300 producers each year. And this, again, goes back to 2018 data, so the user can kind of see how these metrics change by company by year. The last couple slides or dashboards are focusing on comparisons at a company level and at a basin level, or company producers at a basin level. The only reason that these companies right now are defaulted is because they're the number 1 and number 2 producers in the GHGRP. So you can select multiple companies view them, view the metrics associated with each company, from total production, total emissions, intensity associated with those two companies. And then you can go to similar concept, but break it down at a basin level and focus just on producers within a specific basin. So, for the Permian, this is really just looking at the top two producers within the Permian, but we can provide, the user can select a lot of different companies to compare. So I can stop there. There are a ton of data within this. Want to reiterate that there is an Excel spreadsheet that does provide most of the data that are provided in these dashboards. There's additional breakdown, especially by GHG type and an emissions source within the dashboards that are not included in the Excel spreadsheet. But at a high level, a lot of the data that are within these three windows are included in that Excel spreadsheet. So I'll hand it back to Andrew.
Great, thank you, Luke, and thanks to our other speakers, Leslie and Pi. That was fascinating, and I would really encourage folks to check out the online data tool. Letitia linked to it in the chat. You can find it from probably all of our websites, but it's a bit of a wormhole to dive into to sort of explore more detail on kind of what drives emissions in different basins and in different companies. So as promised, we did save quite a bit of time for Q&A. As Letitia noted in the chat, you can feel free to use the Q&A function just to ask questions, and I will try to kind of direct them to the right speaker. But I will start off now with, we've got a sort of a bit of a queue here of questions. I guess maybe sort of addressing the obvious or unobvious issue, and Leslie, you spoke to this a bit in your remarks. The role of super emitters and the sort of the difference between top down and bottom up emissions. So I guess I would love to hear, both from all of you, really, kind of what you think the data in this report is useful for, and where maybe we should use caution in applying it. And also love to hear a bit more about, your thoughts on the proposed changes in subpart W to a more, a more empirically based approach, and what that might mean for kind of emissions in the future. So maybe, I don't know, Leslie, why don't we start with you and then go to Pi and Luke to address some of the more methodological questions.
Sure. Right. So as I noted, the reported emissions don't fully account for those super emitter emissions, but it's still valuable to go through this exercise to see how companies compare when it comes to the reported emissions. At least we can see, even just in the reported emissions, there's a huge amount of variation among companies. But we know that for all companies and across all basins, we're missing a big chunk. And in the report, we have a few pages delving into this top-down, bottom-up discrepancy, and we didn't highlight that in this presentation, but I think we focused on the Permian and showed that top-down measurement aerial surveys have found significantly higher emissions than the emissions reported to the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. But unfortunately, right now, as those measurements come in, they're at the basin level, and it's not possible to attribute those to particular companies. So the hope is that in the future, as measurements get better, we'll be able to attribute those emissions to particular companies. And as the EPA works to incorporate empirical measurements into the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, there's a lot of different ways that can happen, and we will be tracking it closely to make sure that it's based on sound science and the best available technology to be able to start fully accounting for those super emitter emissions.
Great. Pi, anything you would add to that in terms of the use or limitations of the data here?
No, I think I would echo what Leslie said, in that the EPA data is the best data set, the most comprehensive data set we have today. And it provides a consistent methodology. The direct measurement and then top-down data that's coming in, we don't have it for like Leslie said, we can't necessarily attribute those to individual companies. And then I think it would be interesting to see to the extent that EPA does allow for more flexibility in quantification approaches, if that means it's going to take away, you know, the current bottom-up approaches, so that we have consistency, because there's a potential challenge if companies, if we have subpart W data and some of that is calculated using bottom-up default emissions factors and other companies are calculating using direct measurement, it makes it much more difficult to compare those types of emissions data sets.
Great, thank you both. On to the next question here, which gets to the question of data. So question is really around, where did the data come from and are they verified in any way? So I guess, Pi, maybe that's a question for you.
Sure. Yep, I can take a start. So the greenhouse gas reporting program is a regulation, and if companies in the oil and gas industry have facilities that meet the definition as defined by EPA and they emit over 25,000 metric tons of CO2e, again, EPA has that list of 17 sources for the onshore production segment that companies have to calculate emissions for and submit them to EPA. So EPA within the subpart W regulatory text has approved calculation methodologies that companies can use. So for some of them, there's only one, and it's you take your count of these devices and you multiply them by an emissions factor, and everyone does that. Others use engineering calculations. Some use direct measurement, or at least direct measurement is factored in. But for onshore production segment, the majority are default emissions factors. So those are the current regulatory methodologies that EPA allows companies to use. And so they report that each year to EPA. EPA reviews all the data that's reported. You'll see if you go directly to the EPA database, EPA will flag the data sets if it senses there's a problem with them. In our report, we take the data as it's reported. We don't do any adjustments for things that are flagged because there's no way to know exactly what EPA is flagging. And in terms of verification, that is the extent of verification from EPA side for the most part, but individual companies themselves may internally have the data that they report third-party audited, but again, we don't have visibility to that through the public data set, but an increasing number of oil and gas operators are having their either voluntary or regulatory inventories audited and verified by third parties.
Yeah, maybe Leslie, I mean, not to put you on the spot, but I guess, do you have any concerns as somebody who, is somebody who scrutinizes this data with the integrity of any of the data that is submitted? And I guess, I know that, in going through the process, there were a few companies that sort of, jumped out as having data that seemed not quite right. So I wonder if you can speak to, concerns on the integrity side, or with kind of how the data is calculated in the first place.
Sure. Well, as Pi mentioned, the reporting requirements are outlined in it's what's called the subpart W, which is the regulation that outlines the methodology for how companies have to report this emissions, and that's very detailed. But at the same time, there's certain things that might be open for interpretation, or different companies might interpret in different ways, and we have seen that in the data. In a few key instances where different companies are interpreting things in different ways and therefore reporting different levels of emissions. And we've noted that, but as in this current report, we're taking the data as it comes to the EPA, and that's publicly available data source. So we're not scrutinizing or making adjustments or critiques of that data, rather using it as it comes in. But I did want to note that EPA is in the process of, they have a proposal out to update the greenhouse gas reporting program methodology. And there's a lot of things in there, but a lot of it is around clearing up some of those areas where there's room for different interpretations, and trying to make things as clear as possible so that all companies are interpreting things the same way. So EPA is aware of many of those places and is taking active steps to correct them for future reporting years.
Yeah, thanks. And we got a question specifically on that from Sean DePorter, about I think there was some reporting on this from Bloomberg or Reuters about companies, and I think it's maybe generous to say it's an issue of interpretation, because if 99% of companies interpret it one way and 1% interpret it the other way, maybe it's not a difference of opinion, but I mean, could you confirm my understanding that it's a pretty small number of companies that are impacted here, in terms of the companies that have made different assumptions about, say, the hours of operation of particular equipment, for example. It's not something that would affect the analysis in a broad way. It would affect a handful of companies, or is that understating the issue?
No, I think that's right. I mean, we haven't done a thorough study of all of these issues. That was sort of out of the scope of what we were doing here, but it did seem like you were saying, most companies interpret it one way, and there are a handful that interpret it a different way, and it seems incorrect. But it's that is sort of was beyond the scope of what we were trying to do here. But I think I see your point, and I generally agree with that interpretation.
All right, well, great. So it's an issue, but it's not something that would impact the integrity of this analysis. It just means that there are a couple of companies where you'd want to ask some further questions. So lots of questions here, which is great. Keep lobbing them in. One, I guess, very specific question is just asking about the difference between the greenhouse gas reporting program and Quad O and Quad OA. So I don't know, Leslie, if you want to speak to that.
Sure. So the greenhouse gas reporting program is like the name says, it's a reporting program. Companies have to report their emissions using the methodology defined by EPA. That is separate from Quad OA. Quad OA was the 2016 regulation that covered new and modified sources. So those are regulations that actually require equipment standards to reduce emissions from new and modified sources. So obviously they're related because they're covering the same sources. So one is just reporting program, and the other is a regulation that's actually requiring emission reductions.
Great. Well, getting practical here, there's a question on, I think essentially I guess the implications of this analysis, which is, what pathways would we recommend to companies to move forward to actually reduce their methane emissions? Is there a roadmap that companies can follow to use this data and actually bring their emissions down? I mean, Leslie, do you want to start? And then maybe
I can start that. So as we know, the pneumatic controllers were the largest source of reported emissions, and we know that there are cost-effective ways to reduce those emissions, and zero emitting controllers and pumps are becoming much more common. And in fact, in the current EPA proposal for existing sources, that will become the requirement if that is finalized. So we know that that source will come down quite significantly as companies start to comply with that regulation. And then also the leak detection and repair is a major component of the currently proposed regulations. And as I mentioned, those fugitive leaks are sort of underreported in the reporting program. But even so, even though we don't have perfect data on those, that leak detection and repair program will start to reduce those emissions, which is really the goal. We don't need to have perfect data before we can start to reduce emissions. We can implement those regulations now, even before the data is perfect, which the data will never be perfect. So we need to start now.
Great. Pi, anything you would add to that?
Yeah, I would agree in that. I think that when we've talked to different companies and the ways that they're using the data, they haven't seen the data presented in this way such that they can see themselves on an apples to apples comparison with other companies, and allows them to do some peer analysis using consistent approaches, whereas individual companies are often reporting, they might report their methane intensity, but what goes in the numerator and what goes in the denominator is different from what other companies might be doing. So it's hard to make comparisons. But also just companies often haven't seen their data broken out this way. They report the data into EPA, but they might not necessarily have the time and resources to look at it, what it looks like when it comes out, when it's organized this way. So it helps them identify areas where, like Leslie said, like things like pneumatics that they can reduce emissions on. And we talked a little bit about the limitations of the data, but you can also see some real world improvements in the things like pneumatics. But I think another trend that really stood out was in associated gas venting and flaring was a big decline that is associated with the build out of gathering infrastructure in places like the Permian and the Williston and oil heavy plays, where previously a lot of that gas was stranded and being vented or flared. And we've seen in 2020, you could see the beginning of a big drop in those emissions. So definitely helps companies or other stakeholders who are interested identify areas where companies can make real world improvements.
Great. And that, that maybe leads into the next question. I mean, so Pi, you just spoke a bit to the idea of how companies could use or are using the data. How have you seen, or could you imagine other stakeholders using the data, whether it's investors, policymakers, community groups? How would you like to see this data kind of put to use in the real world? So maybe Pi, I'd start with you because you're the data guru, and then we'll go to Leslie next.
Sure. I mean, I think one way that we're seeing it used throughout the broader natural gas value chain is it helps. So there's a lot of interest now related to certified gas or responsibly sourced gas, with companies trying to so power generators or big industrial users or gas utilities trying to source natural gas with a lower GHG profile. So basically reducing their own life cycle emissions by trying to reduce the small percentage that is associated with their upstream value chain. And so this provides, at a high level, alumni of the certification programs use the NGSI methane intensity metric to evaluate company performance. And so this is, I think, one way that allows, again, this isn't certified or anything like that, but it allows at a high level, using the public data, companies to evaluate the emission performance of the producers that they might be buying gas from.
And I would add, I mean, Luke walked us through the interactive tools, and I think those are really useful for drilling down into specific companies or specific basins. And I can see that being very useful for local or community groups who want to understand the companies in their particular region and how those companies, how much they're emitting and how those companies compare to other companies in the basins and companies nationwide. So I think the interactive tool that Luke showed is really valuable. And sort of in the overall report, it wasn't possible to highlight every single company story, but now, because we have the interactive tool, anyone can drill down and understand the companies and regions that are most relevant for them.
Great. And that somehow tees up another question. So you guys are somehow inadvertently doing a great job of going through the Q&A here. Maybe this is a question for Luke to start. So a question about the global warming potential options for methane, and just, those are obviously very significant choices made, right? If you use a 20-year potential versus a 100-year potential. I guess maybe Luke, could you speak a bit more about kind of what that even means? So for folks who aren't maybe deeply familiar with with the arcana around methane, and why that's actually an incredibly important sort of question to answer when you think about understanding the importance of methane in addressing climate change, and what changes in those assumptions might mean for industry thinking around addressing methane. So that's maybe an overly broad and philosophical question, but just would kind of put the broad question of GWP choice to you and see what you have to say, and then we can go to Leslie and Pi as well.
Yeah. So I mean, just at a high level, global warming potential is each pollutant, each gas has one, and it's all normalized it's relative to CO2. So it's kind of just determining, or it reflects the warming impact of a pollutant relative to CO2. But because different gases have different atmospheric lifespans and they break down more quickly than CO2 and they're short-term greenhouse gases, their GWP or warming impact changes through time. So a 20-year GWP corresponds with when methane concentration is greatest. Effectively, this is really high level explanation, but kind of as it breaks down, its warming impact declines. That's why the 100-year GWP is much lower than the 20-year. The 100-year selection for methane and N2O is generally the industry standard. That's how GHGRP 25,000 metric ton of CO2e threshold is calculated. That's using AR4 100-year. So that's kind of the reason why it was kept that way in the report. But the interactive tool allows selection of the 20-year time frame. So that can be a workaround. For how it relates to OGMP, I would probably punt that to Leslie or Pi, but that's the quick breakdown of
Yeah, I
GWP.
mean, Leslie, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, if you, when you talk to companies or to policymakers or anyone really who's worried about methane, I mean, how do you frame this issue of GWP and how to think about long-term and short-term impacts?
Yeah, I mean, it's always good to keep in mind both the 100-year and the 20-year GWP. 20-year GWP is very important for us though, because methane, like Luke said, is a short-lived climate pollutant, and it has a huge impact in the when it's first emitted in the first 20 years. And because of that, it has a huge impact, but also reducing methane will be a huge short-term win for the climate and help us reduce reduce the climate impacts in the short term, which is so critical for the next 20 years. So even though in the PDF version of the report, we use 100-year, just to be consistent with EPA, it's very important to use 20-year, and for a lot of audiences, we focus on that 20-year. And I also wanted to mention that so in the interactive report, where we show both the AR4 values and the AR6 values, and that's sort of technical, and that refers to studies that the IPCC has done, and those change over time because the science is constantly improving. I mean, the overall story doesn't change, but new studies come out and we refine our understanding of exactly the climate warming impact of methane. And so those numbers do change slightly over time, but the overall story has remained the same.
We should probably note that last year's report used AR5 values. So that AR6 came out between the release of last year's report and this year's report. So we've updated it to reflect the most recent science, but the AR5 GWPs typically had higher values than AR6, but AR6 is higher than AR4. It's, this error bars are decreasing with each iteration of the report. But for those of you who are aware or familiar with last year's report and this year's report, they're not necessarily, the data points in them are not necessarily comparable because they are using different GWP values to normalize GHG emissions at a CO2 equivalent level. So everything that's within the dashboard and all of the time series charts in the report are consistently applying AR6 values. But just if you're looking at the PDF of last year and the PDF of this year, it's not quite apples to apples.
Great. And I will ask one last question, which is going to be a combination of a few questions, but really around the general theme of direct measurement. So there's a question around whether the EPA might require direct emissions monitoring to improve data quality. I know, Leslie, you spoke to the IRA provisions around, more empirical sourcing of measurement. And I guess, a follow-on question is just how direct measurements, particularly as we get improved, attribution of emissions to specific companies, could be included in future iterations. And I guess the last question linking to all that, which I will confess I don't fully understand, is whether we can use the blockchain for all of this. Basically, whether there's a way to create an industry level kind of reporting blockchain connected to direct measurement that would solve some of the issues around emissions estimates. So kind of a big set of questions, but really around this theme of basically how do we go from here to there, right? We know we need to improve data quality. We don't want to lose the good of what the EPA process has given us in terms of a lot of the detail, but also want to make sure we capture all the sources that we know are out there in terms of super emitters. So maybe Leslie, I'll start with you with that very big question, and then
I was I think you're right that we don't want to lose that granular detail. Bottom-up inventories are, they're not perfect, but they're great at having that granular level of detail. And that's one thing that's so valuable about them. But the technology for the top-down measurements is constantly improving. It's, there's a lot of research going on and a lot of different types of technologies that are developing, whether it's drones or truck-based systems or airplane flyover systems or static continuous monitoring systems or even satellites. In all those cases, there's a lot of technology and instruments that are being developed and statistical methods that are being refined to account for all and improve those measurements and incorporate those measurements into inventories. So I can't fully summarize all of that work that's going on. But like I said, the EPA it has to move forward with incorporating empirical measurements. It's not clear exactly what they will do. There's a lot of different ways, and it's a very active area of science. But there's been so much improvement just in the past couple of years, and it will continue to improve in the future. So I'm not sure that fully answers it. It's constantly evolving, but there's definitely hope that all of this new data and these new instruments will allow us to have both a top-down measurements and granular equipment based information in a fully integrated way in the future.
Great. And Pi, any last words from you or Luke from you on direct measurement or anything else before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think I would just reiterate everything that Leslie just said in that, the top-down piece right now is great because it allows us to see what the actual atmospheric impact of all the emissions are. But if companies are doing that and they just see the methane plume and they can't trace it back to an individual source, it's not helpful because it doesn't let them know what needs to be repaired necessarily, depending on what the resolution is. And I think the current subpart W revisions that are in a proposed phase right now, EPA is seeking comment on alternative methodologies and technologies that could be used to quantify. We talked about how the methane fee in the IRA directs EPA to revise subpart W again to use to allow for more accurate empirical data. I mean, there's potential that some of that gets captured in the current round of rulemaking. And then EPA also has sent under White House review right now the 111B and C rules that a supplemental proposal for those that will probably focus more on monitoring as opposed to quantification. But I mean, there's a lot of overlap with dual purpose nowadays between monitoring and quantification. So that's another realm where companies might be required or have the opportunity to roll out monitoring technologies that can also directly quantify emissions.
Great. Well, we've got less than a minute left, so I'm gonna stop us here and just thank all of our participants and also everyone who attended today. There were a lot of great questions asked. We're hoping to see this as the beginning of a conversation. So you've got the report. Well, you've got the link to the online resource. We'll send some additional resources to everyone who registered in the coming days. This is obviously an issue that is important, but also in flux. So feel free to reach out to myself or to Tisha or any of the speakers if you have kind of follow-on questions. And if not, we'll look forward to connecting with you all in the future. So thanks everyone for taking part today. Take care.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.